There are 6 areas of sewing that if every time we start a project, we go through these 6 areas and make sure that we know all the answers to these 6 areas before we start our project, that our garment, is more likely to be successful. Hello, my name is Peggy Sagers of Silhouette Patterns, and the purpose of this DVD is to help you learn, for those who do not know how to sew, what supplies you'll need, and so that every time you make a garment, that garment will be exactly as you planned it to be. I love to sew. It's been my passion for over 40 years. I was fortunate enough to major in fashion merchandising and fashion design. I went on to be a pattern maker in the ready-to-wear industry. And I even had my own dress line for a short period of time. And then I even got a chance to sew on Elvis Stojko's costumes he's an Olympic gold medalist in ice skating, and I got a chance to work behind the scenes on his costumes. All of these things have brought me to realize what I really love to do is teach. And so here we are today, which brings me to teaching you how to sew. I think I meet so many women who learn to sew, and yet they have so many habits that take a lot of time. So the goal here today is to streamline the process, because I have been in the factories. The factories have had to streamline the process because so many of the garment making has gone overseas that here in the US they've had to get quicker and better and faster at producing garments, which I don't know if there's any one of us who doesn't want to be quicker, faster, and better at producing our garments. The very first area we're going to talk about today is sewing supplies. There's so many times I've been to Joann's or Hancock's and I see these poor mothers in a frenzy because their daughter or son is taking a sewing class and they've got this long list of the things they need to buy. And I think to myself, oh, how sad, because there's so many of those things I don't think I ever even got out of the package. So let's go through them just to make sure. And before you start to sew, I wouldn't even buy a single thing. Other than this DVD, I wouldn't buy a single thing because you'll develop habits. A lady sent me an email a little while ago. She says, you know, it sure is hard to break old habits. And that's really true. So the purpose here is to really develop good habits so that we won't have to break them as we go down the road. Let me start off with tracing wheels. Now, some of these, somebody mentioned to me a little while ago, why would you even tell them about a tracing wheel? Well, because you'll experience a tracing wheel somewhere down the road and you'll say, gosh, why don't I know about a tracing wheel? So I want you to know about all these supplies and then decide for yourself whether you'll use them or not. The tracing wheel is like a little pizza wheel. It's got little spiky edges, and the purpose is to roll it along the tissue with basically a carbon paper underneath, and it's to transfer the markings that are on your tissue onto the fabric below. So the markings would be your grain line, or maybe your darts, or maybe where to gather, those important parts of the tissue that need to be transferred onto the fabric. So the tracing wheel does that with this carbon piece of paper between the tissue and the cloth. This tracing wheel kind of rolls over it and transfers those markings. Let's show you a little more contemporary version, which I'm going to just bring my easel in here for just a minute. Here's my fabric. Here's my tissue, and the main reason we end up doing this is because when we buy a silhouette pattern, we buy all of the sizes in that pattern, and yet sometimes we gain weight, we lose weight, sometimes we're sharing that pattern with a friend or a sister, and so we don't want to actually cut our exact size. We want to take advantage of all of the sizing. So if you notice, this is a Sharpie marker, just a good old 50-cent Sharpie marker. I'm going to just draw right along the markings that I want to have present, any markings, whatever markings they be. And what you'll see is they'll actually transfer right onto the cloth below. So that is the easiest, quickest way. The negative of the tracing wheel is it makes little holes in my tissue, so it actually perforates my tissue. And after tracing that a couple times, it isn't going to happen anymore. Your tissue is just going to dissolve. So we're going to use Sharpie over a tracing wheel. I have a seam ripper. Seam ripper is just for that. Let me make sure you understand what a seam is, because we're all beginners here. A seam is when I take 2 pieces of fabric, I put right sides together or even wrong sides together, and I run it through the sewing machine, and the joining of those 2 pieces of fabric results in what we call a seam. Now, you may not believe this, but every time we make a seam, it may not be perfect, and we may decide to undo that seam. And there's a good old joke is, as you sow, so shall you reap. So as you sow, so you shall rip. All right, but anyway, so there's all kinds of fancy seam rippers, which basically take the seam apart. This one, very low budget, $1.99. This one, made by Ginger, beautiful, beautiful, $20, $25. So depending on how much you want to spend on undoing your mistakes, you can decide from there. The concept is it's a very sharp blade, and you put it in between, and you literally cut the thread. Now, when I was in college, I had a sewing teacher, and she used to sew for Lady Bird Johnson. She was a German lady. She never let us use either one of those because she believed that there was a possibility that it would pick our fabric. And if you notice, the negative of this is that as you cut all those little pieces of fabric, of thread, all of those little threads are left in there, and you got to go back and pick it all out. So here's the only way we were allowed to do it. We had to start, we had to actually get the thread, we had to pick it with our fingers, and we pulled. Now, the stitch is made up of the top thread and the bobbin thread, and so if you pull on opposite sides, you'll see that it pulls the seam out quite well. And what I like about it is that you don't have to go back and pick out all those little pieces. This is so much faster and so much easier. People say to me all the time, you don't use a seam ripper? No. Well, how do you get your seams undone? Well, I undo them with my fingers. They just can't believe that. This is so much easier. And a lot of times, as you're going along, if you just kind of give it a tug, it'll start to pull either way. Now, I'm not telling you you can't use a seam ripper. I'm saying to you, this takes a lot more time to undo a seam, even though you wouldn't think it, than it does to use your fingers. Chalk is a way, again, of transferring markings from the tissue to the actual fabric. We're going to show you how chalk isn't really necessary when we go to mark darts. We'll show that a little bit later. Beeswax, this is a good antiquated concept. It generally was used to lubricate the needle. So when we were sewing through really thick fabrics, the needle would help us, it would help get the needle through all these thick layers. Fabrics have so progressed and gotten away from something like that. I can't even imagine that that's even, I'm surprised it was even out the store for sale, but I bought it so that I would at least be able to expose you to it. A seam guide. This is a 6-inch little ruler. It comes handy when you're trying to know seam allowances, but I'm going to teach you the seam allowances included in the pattern. Silhouette seam allowances are always 3/8 because I think it's in factories, you don't have to trim, you don't have to reduce. It's so much easier in your sewing, and you're going to see that. A lot of women will measure the seam when they go to sew it, and I'm going to show you to use your foot and your sewing machine as a guide so that this really just won't even be necessary. You know, there might be some cases, but what I want you to do is limit your measuring tools to really 2. One should be a hard surface or a hard curve or a plastic, something that is non-flexible, and that's for measuring the physical pattern. And then one should be a soft measuring tape, and that's actually to measure your physical body or a garment. It would be hard to measure your body if you're trying to do this with something hard because it's not flexible. So if I have one that's hard and one that's flexible, and if I compare the two to make sure the measurements on the two align, then I'm in good shape. And that's really the best things to use, is to limit. Every time I put down a tool and pick up a different one or go to find a different one, it will take me more time. So to condense the amount of time it takes, I'm better off to limit the amount of tools I use. Then I want to show you a ham, and this is a pressing ham, and later on we'll show you a little bit about pressing, and I'll show you if you choose to decide to use one of these or if you choose not to. These are roughly around $30, somewhere right in there. You can see, gosh, if you just go out and buy all these tools, you're clearly $50 to $100 easily because you need a good pair of scissors. And I'm going to tell you, if there's anything I'd spend money on, it's definitely my scissors. Again, when I was in college, we were allowed to choose one pair of scissors. You couldn't choose a big one and a small one pair of scissors. And I think what that has really done for me is I do everything with these big scissors. There's a lot of times when I'm fitting women and I'll be fitting pants, and the first thing you have to do when you're fitting pants is you have to release the stress of the crotch seam. And so I'll go at their crotch with these big scissors, and a lot of them go, whoa, whoa, whoa. They just don't understand how good I am at these big scissors. All right, so we've got curves. Now I'm going to say a French curve, and I've got a whole DVD or part of a DVD on how to use a French curve. It's really important that you learn how to use one, but it's not necessarily in the beginning something you have to do. But I do want to show you that what a French curve does is it follows the neckline. It follows the neckline of a garment. It follows actually all the curves of our body. It follows the armholes of our garments. So we can actually lay a French curve down on our garments. We can pick up the shaping or the size of the armhole we like and transfer it back to the pattern to make sure we like it. But again, I just want to familiarize you with this, not necessarily get you to be an expert at this point. Our thread, I do want to mention thread because there's a big price difference in thread. And it doesn't matter what factory you're in, all the way from Armani, Chanel, gosh, down to whatever, no name. The thread that's being used is the exact same, and it's a polyester. This is Gutermann, which you all know, you may not know, but in sewing worlds, Gutermann is like, oh, I only sew with Gutermann thread. But what I want you to notice on this Gutermann is it says 100% polyester. This is, and this little spool of thread, I'm not sure how many yards there are, 274 yards, and this will cost about $4. This is 12,000 yards, and this will cost about $12. So when you do the math, there's a huge difference between what you can pay for thread. So, there's all kinds of concepts, and sewing machine dealers will tell you that some produce more lint and all those things. I would just say use what's comfortable for you, but don't think the success or failure of your garment is going to be about the thread. It's just simply not going to be. Then there's pins. Pins are really important. A pin cushion where you can put those pins. You are going to need to secure fabrics together, and pins are the easiest and simplest way to do that. A lot of people use pins when cutting out. I don't. I use weights, and again, that's factory based. So we're going to go and show you how you can quickly just put those weights on a piece of fabric when you're spreading it out, and you don't even have to go buy weights. That's not necessary. You can take anything that's kind of convenient and handy and just stick it on, and that's going to hold the tissue to the pattern. That's the only goal, is holding the tissue to the fabric. So anything that does that works. These weights, actually a friend/customer made these for me, and I just absolutely love them. They're full of little BBs. So like I said, but you'll see weights in the store, and you'll see, gosh, they're 10, 12, you can spend all kinds of money on weights. And then we'll have sewing needles. We'll talk a little bit about those later, because we'll talk about the different brands and what the different numbers mean, just so you can be aware. So those are our sewing supplies. We're going to talk minimal what you need as we pick our project. Our project that we're going to pick today is our yoga pant.